You have asked me to speak about the struggle for the future, especially from the standpoint of the left or of the progressives and of the major developing countries. Such an argument is necessarily an argument about institutions and institutional change and the ideas that can and should inspire it. The subtext of the argument is a proposition that should be uncontroversial. Ideas are not enough to change the world, but without ideas we cannot hope to change it. However, I want to begin from a different place, by speaking to the social base or constituency of the alternatives before I speak to their institutional content. Most men and women in the world today remain poor and disorganized. What they most desire is to own a little farm, a small shop in town, or to offer a technical service for which they can charge a fee. They don't belong objectively to a small business class, at least not yet, but they have assimilated a culture of self-help and initiative. We could call them a subjective petty bourgeoisie. This subjective petty bourgeoisie, although poor and disorganized, as I said, is today the vast majority of humanity. They are powerless to bring about a substantial transformation in their countries, or even to achieve a decisive solution to the problems of their own families, without having an ally in the moneyed elite of their class societies. In the elites, in the national elites around the world, the predominant element today is comprised of rentiers. If not financial rentiers, then rentiers of natural resources. For there to be a transformation going in the direction for which I will argue, there must arise a division within the national elite between the rentiers and a productivist or nationalist counter-elite. This counter-elite must seek power, and having won power, be able to offer the popular majority of the subjective petty bourgeoisie alternatives to its default aspiration of isolated, archaic, relatively unproductive family business. Today, that alternative is no longer a job in conventional industry. It's some form of access to the new vanguard of production, which we call the knowledge economy. This vanguard has emerged in all the major economies of the world, but always in an insular or socially exclusive form. The productivist counter-elite must be able to begin to open the pathway to a knowledge economy for the many that can replace what we have in the world, which is a knowledge economy for the few. And in that knowledge economy for the many, the subjective petty bourgeoisie can hope to reinterpret its aspirations in a way that leads to decisive change, to an uplift. Now with that, I then turn to the institutional content of my argument, first in the economy and then in politics. And in the economy, let me distinguish the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, we must first make a distinction between two elements. There is a preliminary. The preliminary is to subordinate the interests of finance and of the financial rentiers to the interests of production, and above all of this rebellious strategy of national growth. In many countries there still prevails an idea of financial confidence. We must win the confidence of the financial markets to receive capital and investment, which will in turn lead to growth. No country has successfully developed on that basis. The religion of finance, its orthodoxy, its preconceptions, its interests, matter only in the very short term. In the medium to long term, the only thing that matters is economic reality and the opportunities for gain that it generates. But that doesn't mean that we should then embrace vulgar Keynesianism, the alternative to neoliberalism and to financialism, with its idea that saving is much more the consequence than the cause of growth, and its disregard for the discipline of surplus and saving. In the early stages of a process of national growth, it may be necessary to have a high fiscal surplus, a high level of public and private saving, and even if the country is indebted in foreign currency, a high level of expensive reserves. Not to win the confidence of the financial markets, but for precisely the opposite reason, so that the nation and its government not be on their knees dependent on financial confidence, the fiscal shield of national rebellion. Second, it is vital that the cost of capital, the interest rate, always be lower than the average rate of return to a business. Otherwise, all productive activity is irrational. And that in turn leads to a third element of this preliminary, which is that if there is a banking cartel, we must break its backbone by radicalizing competition in the banking or the financial sector. And in many countries, the most direct way to radicalize competition in the banking sector is to revoke the usury laws and allow the entire population to compete with the banks by lending money to one another. That's the preliminary that comes first. Subordinating the interests of finance to the interests of the real economy. The second short-term element is to begin to create the basis for bringing the subjective petty bourgeoisie, the popular majority, up to the point where it can access an emergent knowledge economy and be its co-author. There are two groups that are crucial, two entities that are crucial. On the one hand, the small and medium-sized businesses that continue to offer most of the jobs and produce a major part of the product. And on the other hand, the multitude of individual economic agents who have no stable connection to any business enterprise. The vast numbers who are in the so-called informal economy, in the shadows of the economy beyond the protection of the laws, and in the formal economy, the increasing part of the labor force that is in circumstances of precarious employment. Their capabilities have to be elevated so that they can begin to operate with some form of the more advanced technologies and practices that would be required by a knowledge economy for the many. Now, we need instruments for this. In my country, for example, in Brazil, these instruments are the legacy of the corporativist political economy that was of the Vargas period, that in the middle of the 20th century was the political background to import substituting industrialization. Embrapa, the agricultural organization, SEBRAE, that monitored the practices of the small and medium-sized businesses, SINAI and SINAC, the network of technical schools, and the public development banks, especially the large National Development Bank. Where the instruments don't exist, they have to be created. And their destination has to be these two groups that I described as the priority. To lift them up, to enhance their capabilities. That's the basic cognitive and social background of the replacement of the knowledge economy for the few by a knowledge economy for the many. In the medium term, the priority has to be to reinvent the logic of technological evolution. Technology has no imminent logic of evolution. It has the logic of evolution that we give it. And this logic of evolution should obey three criteria. The first criterion is that we should prefer those technologies that are capable of being understood, assimilated, and operated by the two groups that I mentioned. The multitude of individual economic agents and the small and medium-sized firms of the backward peripheral economy. Not by a small coterie, a small clique of vast enterprises with vast pools of liquid capital. The recreation of technology in this form so that it becomes assimilable by the subjective petty bourgeoisie is not less ambitious, it's more ambitious than the attempt simply to continue the logic that addresses high technology to the interests and capabilities of the largest size firms. Don't think of the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley as the natural home of the knowledge economy, because in fact they are an anomaly. They're an anomaly dependent on a series of accidental features, such as the feature of being able to do business in a resource, the data of their customers, which is made free by the accident of a lacuna in the law of intellectual property. The second criterion of the logic of technological evolution is that we should prefer those forms of technology that equip and empower work to the forms that simply replace work. All technological evolution, to some extent, replaces labor. But some forms of technological evolution equip and empower it as well as replacing it, creating other jobs and making other forms of work possible. And the third criterion of technological evolution is that its ultimate goal, the goal that directs its movement up, should not be to create a machine that is a proxy for the human mind, what we call now artificial general intelligence. It should be to create a machine that has powers that we can't have, we human beings, vast computational powers, but that lacks our precious attribute of imagination, so that we can collaborate with it. Everything that we have learned how to repeat we can express in a formula or in an algorithm, and we can then embody the formula or the algorithm in a mechanical device. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat so that we can preserve our precious and indeed, in a sense, our only resource, which is our time for the not yet repeatable. Then the partnership of the machine with the anti-machine, the human being with imagination, can be immensely more powerful than either of them alone. Now, what this means, I could express just metaphorically for the moment by robbing a remark from Schopenhauer, who in his masterwork distinguishes the talented man from the genius. He says, the talented man is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. The genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. It's a form of visionary power, of imagination, inspiring the perpetual creation of the new. It's not a form of facility or power. That's what the machine can have. What we can have is the vision of the new. And that should be the object of this technological evolution. Now we come to the long term of the economy in this direction. And the long term has to do with the property regime and with the legal and institutional form of the market. The market order does not have a singular, natural, and necessary form. The market can exist in any number of forms. The thesis that the market has a necessary form is the thesis of market fundamentalism. And even ideas like the idea of varieties of capitalism are just a light form of market fundamentalism. Even at the most abstract level, a market has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other direction is the degree of control that each of those agents has over the resources at their command. The market fundamentalists suppose that these two dimensions go naturally and necessarily together. In fact, they don't go together, and they contradict each other. One of the ways to increase absolute decentralization is by relativizing the absolute and perpetual character of the control that each of the agents has over the resources at his command. Let me relate this to a historical problem, the problem that was bequeathed to us by the early 19th century. Take, for example, the United States in the period between independence and the Civil War. There were two economies. In the South, there was a slave economy, but in the North, there was an economy of petty proprietors, of tradesmen, of artisans. Only one white man in 5 worked for another white man when Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s. After the Civil War, both of these economies were destroyed. The slave economy in the South and the economy of petty proprietors in the North. The liberals and socialists of the 19th century, from Karl Marx to John Stuart Mill, who believed that economically coerced labor was an inferior and transient form of free labor, inferior to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, were enabled to show how those higher forms could be made compatible with the aggregation of resources at scale. That's the problem that the 19th century left unsolved. And we could solve it by vesting in the long term the means of production, liquid capital, and the major resources of production in a set of funds, which would auction off capital to their most efficient takers, the takers who could provide the fund with the highest rate of return under a number of different schemes of risk and return that would be designed by the democratic institutions. So this regime of capital auctioning would be a regime in which there would be no owners. It would be, you could call it capitalism without capitalists. Because no one would permanently own or be able to transmit by inheritance the means of production. They would belong to society, but they would be temporarily used by the takers. Now, curiously, of course, this is convergent with the orthodox theory of finance, which is that in a perfectly capital market, perfectly competitive capital market, the market gives resources to their most efficient users. In a way, the thought experiment that I just suggested to you of the firms is a way of seeing whether this theoretical proposition can really be made to happen in practice. So, conditional, fragmentary, temporary property rights would be the primary form of economic decentralization. We would always want to have something like the traditional absolute unified property right because it has a great advantage. It has the advantage of allowing someone, the owner, to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in. But we wouldn't want that to be the only form of economic decentralization, which would be pure dogmatism in order to have an experimental economy. So there you have a description of the evolution of the market order away from what we call capitalism in the service of the uplift of the productivist and creative impulse of society. Now, in what kind of political order could the pressure for this reshaping of the economy be sustained? All of the democracies that exist in the world are weak democracies by a triple standard. First, they're weak because they coexist peacefully with the class structure of society. The class order contradicts democracy. And these democracies are democracies that don't make trouble, or at least don't make enough trouble for the class order, and are therefore relatively sterile in the production of cumulative structural change. Second, they are all democracies in which change continues to depend on crisis, in the double form of economic distress or ruin and war. Their rule is no trauma, no transformation. And the third criterion by which to assert that they are weak democracies is that they maintain the power of the past to determine the future. The path dependency of society. The societies are like in orbits, and we don't have in democratic politics, and it is now organized, a way of knocking the societies out of their orbits and overthrowing the rule of the living by the dead. The creation of high-energy democracies, which would succeed by these three tests that I just cited, depends on a series of institutional innovations. And now let me mention three sets of institutional innovations. Not the only ones, but enough to give you an idea of the direction of what I have in mind. First, these high-energy democracies should be high-temperature democracies. By high-temperature democracy, I mean a democracy based on a high level of popular engagement in political life. The premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that democratic politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti or extra institutional. In other words, that at the end of the day, we have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. But this thesis is false. Political institutions can differ in the level of political engagement, depending on the relations between politics and the media, or politics and money, or the electoral regimes, or the legal framework of voting, whether it's optional or mandatory, for example. So we would want a kind of democratic politics that is at the same time institutional and hot. The second set of institutional innovations would be innovations that accelerate the tempo of politics. For example, in the American constitutional arrangements, widely copied in Latin America, there is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. Madison's scheme of checks and balances, which inhibits the political transformation of society. And our aim should be to hasten the pace of politics at the same time that we raise its temperature and its fecundity in programs of structural change. So we could say whenever there's an impasse, the impasse should be immediately dissolved, either by comprehensive programmatic plebiscites or by early elections. The early elections could be called unilaterally by either of the political branches, but the branch that called it would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. In other words, the elections would always be bilateral for both branches. And a third set of institutional innovations would exploit the potential for experimentation in federal systems. So we say as a society goes down a certain path, choosing a direction by strong initiatives, it allows parts of itself to secede from the dominant solution and offer countermodels of the national future. The countermodel should be practical. It should be enforced. It shouldn't be just a set of ideas or abstractions. And you can imagine two stages. First, a stage in which the main instrument of experimentalism is cooperative federalism, vertical cooperation among the three levels of the federation, or horizontal cooperation among the states or provinces. And then there would be a second moment, which you could call very wide divergence, in which a part of the country, a sector or state, applies for the right of very wide divergence. Of course, this right would always have to be vetted politically and judicially to prevent it being used as an instrument of class privilege or persecution. And paradoxically, in this respect, unitary states like Great Britain or France have an advantage over federations. Because in a unitary state, there's no presumption that all powers of the country must enjoy at the same time the same level of the right of divergence. A high-energy democracy is the political counterpart to a knowledge economy for the many. An experimentalist deepening of democratic politics. Now come to the question of globalization. What does all this mean, this internal transformation, for the way in which we would organize global governance? Humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. So we don't want a world government, world empire, but we need a way of governing the world without world government. And actually there's only one way, experience demonstrates. The one way is voluntary cooperative activity, cooperation among the sovereign states, coalitions of the willing. They could be regional coalitions like the European Union or the African Union, or similar state coalitions like the G7 or the Brics of states that have a similar place or function in the world system. Or they could be single-purpose coalitions in which particular states or groups of states band together to solve a practical problem. A practical problem like the absence of technologies that can be used by the popular majority or by the backward firms, or even a very specific problem like the absence of forestry technology appropriate to the management of a heterogeneous tropical rainforest rather than what we have, which is forest technology for the management of a homogeneous temperate forest. Now, the background is world disorder. The two superpowers are both awkward and solipsistic Gullivers that for radically different reasons are unable to help organize the world or even to avoid armed conflict between them. The greatest evil would be war between the great powers. What's the solution? The solution is for the medium-sized powers to develop a structure of cooperation and gradually to engage or entangle the superpowers. The United States, not in imaginative communion with the majority of the world, and China, bereft of true friends and allies, in a structure of cooperation, of practical cooperative activities that help gradually to turn the vinegar of reciprocal belligerence back into the wine of peaceful cooperation. An organization like the Brics would have a very practical goal in this setting of turning the network of cooperative relations among the sovereign states to more dense, more fertile. The goal would be a change, for example, in the world trading regime. The world trading regime under the WTO treaties and under the multilateral arrangements that have to some extent superseded them, like the Trans-Pacific or the Transatlantic, are now based on an institutional maximalism. They require that the trading countries adhere not just to the abstract idea of a market economy, which can take radically different forms, but to a very particular version of a market economy. A version which, for example, prohibits the trading countries from establishing the kind of cooperative arrangements between businesses and governments that the countries that are now rich used to become rich but that they want to deny to the latecomers. Or the incorporation into the rules of the world trading system of the odious regime of intellectual property developed at the end of the 19th century that leaves many of the technological innovations of greatest interest to humanity in the hold of a small number of private multinational businesses. The principle for which we should struggle should be an institutional minimalism. The minimum of restraint on the institutional experiments that we can perform in the reshaping of the market order and of politics and of the relation between business and governments. We know that an institutional minimalism is feasible because an institutional minimalism is what characterized the regime prior to the WTO, the regime of the GATT. And because an institutional minimalism was the characteristic for centuries of the development of the law merchant, which developed a law of international commercial transactions superimposed on the diversity of the underlying national rules and jurisdictions. A world that reconciles global order with national diversity and conceives the ultimate aim to be not the maximization of free trade, but the creation of a system that allows countries with radically different strategies of national development and experiences of civilization to coexist peacefully in a world order that gradually becomes more open. Underlying all of this institutional argument about the economy, about politics, and about a global order without world government, is a certain conception of what should distinguish the right from the left, the conservatives from the progressives. The conventional idea now is that the progressives are those who privilege equality against the background of the established institutional order. And the conservatives are those who privilege freedom against the same background. Shallow freedom against shallow equality, if the criterion of shallowness is the acceptance of the present institutional order. I propose a different conception of the relation between left and right. The progressives, the leftists, should be distinguished by two criteria. The first criterion has to do with the practice. The leftists are those who are willing to transgress the frontiers of the established institutional framework. Not in the way that the Marxists imagine, the substitution of one system by another system, which leads to a binary idea of politics. Politics is either the reformist substitution of one system, the revolutionary substitution of one system by another, or the reformist management of the present system. All structural change is fragmentary. The idea of total change is an idealized limit of structural change. And the second criterion is the aim. The aim of the progressives should be a shared bigness. The conservative view is that it's natural for human life to be small. And only an elite of innovators, disruptors, geniuses, saints, heroes is exempt from this universal decree of belittlement. The progressive conception is that we can all become bigger and rise to a higher level of intensity, of scope, of power, of vision in our lives, provided that we become bigger together. For 300 years there has been a revolutionary project in the world. The world has been on fire. And this revolutionary project has had two sides. The political side, sustained by the doctrines of democracy, of liberalism and socialism, promising to lift the grid of entrenched division and hierarchy that weighs on human life. And a personalist side, sustained above all by Romanticism and by the worldwide popular romantic culture that has carried to every shanty town and village in the world the sublime message that we are not so ordinary after all. And that we can become more human by becoming more godlike, by increasing our quota in the divine attribute of transcendence. Now, this revolutionary project, with its two sides, the political side and the political side, is now in the paradoxical situation of being both strong and weak. It remains the strongest project in the world because although it has many enemies, its enemies all respond to it. But it's simultaneously weak because its votaries no longer know what its next step should be. And the project of world revolution will die if we cannot breathe new life and new meaning into it, both with respect to its practice and with respect to its programmatic content. The law of the Spirit is that we can keep alive only what we renounce and reinvent. Our lives happen to have fallen in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary program. We should not allow our deeds and our thoughts to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude, although we should remember Voltaire's warning that those who lack the spirit of their age will nevertheless have all of its defects. Once we have brought the counter-revolutionary interlude to a close, world revolution will continue, and humanity will resume its prophetic ascent.